Thank you. Thank you, Amin. Can I have my first slide, please? Thank you all for coming. I'm sure it's quite cold out there. I want to start by saying, Your Excellencies, because I know there are a couple in here, ladies and gentlemen, either, neither, and both, thank you for attending. I want to thank the Soane team for 3 months' worth of effort to get me here today. And I want to just make a quick confession that, I was told I should talk about climate, but I decided that I'm going to talk about a kind of tripartite hypothesis, because I don't think there is a single story. At a time when every preamble list of dinners, writings, everything we do is loaded up with crises, that's then topped up with the climate issue. So my talk is not about separating climate from environmentalism from social justice or equity. I can't separate these 3 things. And I'm going to go quite fast because I have many slides, as you can expect. I called it togetherness because when I was thinking about what to talk about, the thing that I miss the most and the thing that I think is the most absent at every scale, certainly in the last 30 or 40 years, in my opinion, is togetherness. Whether you talk about materials, these sorts of events, cities, countries at war, everything else. The dilemma with something like that, when an engineer tries to speak about it, is we're expected to be binary and solve problems. So I wanted to just qualify it a little bit in that it is, my version of it is rooted in uncertainty, contingency, and vulnerability. I believe in meritocracy, hugely believe in it. So I don't really see any glass ceilings in the life that I've had. But I'll just give you 3 quick slides to give you an autobiography. I have the gift of being of blended origins and heritage and ethnicity from South Africa, East Africa, India, Pakistan, Middle East, and so on. So that kind of makes me a citizen of everywhere. Some people might call it of nowhere, but actually of everywhere. So I have never noticed these glass ceilings. Early career, believe it or not, was up in the north when I arrived here from Uganda after doing an apprenticeship. Designing roller coasters is not a myth, and designing offshore structures. I learned a lot about geometry from the roller coasters, completely about gravity, natural forces, ups and downs of life and industry, but also white-knuckle rides like the one we're having right now. The offshore industry taught me the value of computation very early on because they were ahead of us. The last thing I did before I started my own office was I was brought from the north to look at Battersea Power Station because my company that was doing roller coasters, those of you who are old enough to remember, John Broome from Alton Towers had announced we were going to make a fun palace with roller coasters at Battersea Power Station. So I spent 3 years on that power station, day and night, designing the facade retention, taking out the boilers with a lot of people from Griffiths McGee. I think I couldn't even quote how many tons of copper and so on we took out of there. 6 million bricks, which is roughly the size of 500 average 2-story houses, are that power station. So when people talk about the stuff today, retrofitting and adaptive reuse, let's just be honest about this. This is a medieval concept. Let's not brand it. And by the way, I started and did one of the biggest ones right at the beginning of my career. So here I'll begin. I think science fiction and science fact do come together as a scientist, and I do feel that quite a lot of the science fiction we've seen has come to life, from iPhones to other things. So I found this quote by Frank Herbert from 1965, which says, "It's impossible to live in the past, difficult to live in the present, and a waste to live in the future." And he finishes it with hope clouds observation. So I agree with the first part, but I don't agree with the last part. For me, when he says hope clouds hope clouds it. I think it doesn't. I would prefer to agree in my own words with those who think that to hope is to recognize that what is unlikely is possible, and to hope, and what is likely is not inevitable. So that's the place which I begin from when I talk about climate or any of the other crises. So I thought the way to try and land this today very quickly was through three ways, three kind of very simple paragraphs. One would be observations, provocations, and rants that I will have. And I might offend many of you. It is very deliberate. The quasi-discipline of advanced reverse design, I'll just introduce that as a topic. And then the third area of marbling technology practice and teaching and industry, which is mostly about architecture. So when you start with observations, provocations, the difficult thing is where do you stop? Because there are so many elephants in the room. So the whole lecture could actually have been about just that, and accusing people of stuff and so on. But in an age of immense hidden and fierce tokenization and cancel culture, I was very careful to pick some of the things that I think are relevant for tonight. I started noticing 25 or 26 years ago that design as a word means different things to different people, but particularly the scientific approach versus the architectural approach was completely disjointed. I started noticing architects running towards being engineers, engineers running towards being architects. This was about 25, 26 years ago. And I thought that that would be a fantastic opportunity in all of that confusion to put my entrepreneurial hat on and join the two up. So the practice position was my life's ambition, to set up a design office that would deal with this without changing ourselves too much. That was an early observation. At the same time, I saw that in the field there was a fuzzy logic, a very provocative terrain. We started seeing in engineering and in architecture and in many design disciplines, dolphins, that are very intelligent, but only understand each other and nobody else gets them. Flying fish who are trying to do both things at the same time, do neither well. And then the mutant, which I was part of, because we kind of cross over the dolphin and the fish, to become something else through tools. And last of all, I saw a lot of octopuses with lots of hands, but none of them very good. So that was the second provocation for me to say, how can I make a practice that will be successful given the difficulty of something like that in London? I noticed also that the discipline historically has been fragmented enormously to a point where today you can be an architect, engineer, facade engineer, blah, blah, blah. And I wanted to bring all of that back to what Soane did, which I think was the total builder, client, and everything else. Now, of course, that's a retrospective comment, but those are the kind of things I was interested in. And this particular observation has gotten worse. So I just made this slide very recently. In one of our projects, there are 37 fissures. So there is a real opportunity because there is more things separating us than unifying us in the world of making architecture and making design. And I thought that how do I then project this and continue at least propagating what we might be able to do. So I'm not going to show a lot of projects because that becomes a show and tell, and I don't want to do that. I want to try and explain how I think I've got here. One of the things is examining the medieval methods. You very quickly realize that we have lost a lot since he was here in terms of what we do today. And to fast forward that very quickly, I particularly am very interested in interdisciplinary conversation. And that means integrating knowledge from different disciplines without losing the strength of your expertise. It's subtle, but it's something that I believe in very strongly that I think is fundamental. The problem is the transdisciplinary crisis that we have needs all of us, and you cannot do it through any particular discipline. And I think when we look back all the way to the coherence of the medieval Summa, which gave way to this kind of specialization, we start to see that we need to find another framework of unity. So as a kind of response to that, the practice that I have designed with my colleagues, and I want to thank them, there are many of them in here, my co-pilots at AKT, I don't do all of this on my own, by the way. I decided that my role would be to step back as well as do some amazing buildings. I would also try and theorize at least what we could do as a practice. That's been a very deep interest, both academically and in practice, and we've published quite a bit of that. The other dangerous thing that's happened is in 2020, we started to think, where is the crisis? And at the same time, 2019, 2020, we discovered that we as society had exceeded the anthropogenic mass. In 2020, the Visa Institute showed us that we'd made more material than what was already there from nature. And what's worse is by 2040, we will actually triple this. The other important provocation is the two front lines, one planet that's de-globalizing, and yet we separate this global south and global north. And when we look at old research, this is not new, we see that all the new opportunities are going to be in the global south, and we are going to have to live with everything we've already built and improve that. So there is this binary kind of research, yet it misses out Africa, it misses out the Middle East, it misses out all sorts of things. But nonetheless, I took this as a position. And I thought, well, what about the 2 billion people that are living in informal houses? Why are we saying we shouldn't build? So there are these sorts of questions that struck me, and I started looking more and more at it. And I see that in the 60s, there was a hypothesis, and many of you will be familiar with the population bomb. The hypothesis was, by Elric and others at the time, that it was those poor people over there that are going to kill the rich people over here. That has now been proven wrong. Most of the problems have actually been upside down. The problems of the others, as we call them, have been largely created in reverse by consumption, not population. So it became quite an interesting thing. How does an engineer start to deal with that? Because all we're supposed to do is make buildings stand up. When we look at the life support system of the planet, we see it's getting worse and worse. We've crossed recently, assessing 7 boundaries, we've crossed 6 of them. So in a way, there is a crisis going on, but I'm still very hopeful and very optimistic. And I think in that hope, I've started to, since 2017, rethink everything we'd done before that and look at excellence in a completely different way, with new insights, new ways of thinking, but redefining more than anything else what value means. Value to us in our office, whether my colleagues believe it or not, the way I try to shove it down people's throats is, look, these are the 3 things we do it: value, complexity, efficiency. We do this as a conflict, as an engineering office. There's a conflict between efficiency, technological efficiency, and value, because you can't have all 3 at the same time. This is how we used to do work for the last 20-odd years. The modus operandi now is a sharp turn due to this reimagination, where I feel that the small cube that we were operating in before, because we were kind of compromising all 3 in order to survive, has just gotten bigger through the crises that we talk about. Because now we can define value not as a statue, but more as a dance. We can see that complexity is solvable using any kind of computation, man-to-computer equations. And efficiency can only be dealt with through the planetary boundaries. So that has become actually why I'm hopeful, because I think there are fantastic and huge opportunities around the corner, and the practice is working on this basis. Now, you might say, well, what about the next generation? And I am very conscious. My young daughter's in here. I have 2 young daughters. And I know that the next generation can imagine this as a kind of endless, this is the end of the world, it's doom. But when we see and when we understand that, yes, their anxiety is coming from the fact that if you were born in 2020, roughly, most of the problems of climate are already here. My argument is, and it's based on all the work I've been doing, is actually, even though we know that increasing impacts will be felt by the next generation, that is actually the first generation that can do things sustainably. And to assume that our great-grandparents and the world was in balance is just not true. We were never sustainable as a society. All that has happened is the way we consume things has changed drastically. So if I move to my last but one provocation, John Soane was born in 1753, which Simon Ofer tells me he never used to do calculations, but it was about that point there. What has then happened over that time, in very broad terms, is we've gone from a situation where he was doing the model on the left to a situation where engineers were invented at some point, and we're doing the situation on the right, picking up an elephant through calculations. It's gotten worse as time goes by. You know, we're doing more and more and more through that model. And I think this discipline of structural engineering in itself has been in denial. At least my institution doesn't agree with me, but that's a good thing in my case. I would argue that this way of thinking needs to also go back to finding some kind of unity, and I'll explain how we've tried to do that. So in London, for example, you have the most amazing opportunity, and things that have shaped our minds is really projects like this, where for 25 years we've been working on one building after the other, to a level where there are not many parts in the world that you could gain this kind of experience and some of the provocations I'm putting to you. So the continuity through this city, which has always been built on city past, and many cities are built on cities, but we forget. There's a long game that we learn in what we do as designers that I think we've benefited from as a practice. Sometimes, like in the Olympics, these things happen at very fast speed, and we were fortunate enough to be involved in a number of projects there. So that has helped shape the way I'm trying to explain this. There are other influences. So over 40 years, as well as my own office and my partners helping me, I've been fortunate enough to work with many parts of the world or many other institutions. The Aga Khan Award, which is 40 years old today, I've been involved in for 20 years. The director, Farooq Dashani, is in here. When you look at the range of projects over 40-odd years and the data, you learn about the other. You learn about architecture in other parts of the world, different scales, different types of architecture. So I've been using that as much as I can to develop what we do. That particular award also has an amazing collection of people over time. So almost everyone that I would love to meet or would love to hear speak, because you're inspired by these people, I've come across through that award. So there's been a lot of development and thinking gone on through these people and through the awards, and I'm really happy that it's helped me over 20 years to shape what I'm saying. I think that getting into projects very quickly, if we go back to Islamic cities, for example, we realize that modernization should not be something we should be afraid of, because in this particular project in Mazda, which some people say was a failure and has been a super success, we measured with Norman Foster and partners, all sorts of ideas from 4,000-year-old cities in terms of how they've survived. These are made out of mud. And what could we put them through in terms of technology in order to arrive at a new version of some of the tangible parts of the old heritage, rather than just making them survive. And you can see the tools that we used to make this work. The outcome was that we were 5 degrees difference in temperature. And remember, we're trying to target 2 degrees globally in one particular street a particular day. So post-occupancy and going back and measuring and checking some of these things has been super important. And if we don't modernize properly, we're threatening ecology in some way. moving through that kind of thinking, extreme environments are where you get quite a lot of benefit. And in Sharjah, we started to do work with cooking sections. My colleagues measured everything, and we designed a very simple garden where new types of plants are growing in an urban condition. So through technological moves, we're able to bring things back from history. This is today, 3 years later, grown into something quite incredible. And most of that was done through very soft, very beautiful architecture, design, but also weapons-grade tools in terms of technology. You know, there's a lot of that stuff available for us. And it scales up. So in the same region, 10 years ago, we won a competition to catch the wind in Sheikh Zayed National Museum, and it's just finishing now. So it's taken a while, but we're able to do these things. So extreme environment, and as they arrive here and other places, are not something to fear. It's how we mitigate and how we might deal with it through design. And it doesn't just rely on our species. We also think about, this is a project I did with office architects at Harvard, where we got to think about a rescue building in Ljubljana on top of a mountain where people were dying. There was no place to shelter. And that extreme environment offered an opportunity to look very quickly at how you could put some shelter up there. And we thought of flying one up, so changing the concept of a drone as a weapon, changing it into a tool and saying, well, how can we take a drone to put this up? Not necessarily, it's a beautiful building, as you can see, and we managed to do it with helicopters in the end, but the idea really was, how can we get past a donkey when you need to build up there in places in the world where this is still going on? Humans and donkeys are trying to get to these environments. I can say that the unfortunate thing was that the drone people backed down at the last minute, and we had to use a helicopter to do it. Global shifts continue to conspire our thirst for unprecedented solutions to the high-rise building. I want to say that those that say we shouldn't build tall buildings are wrong. I will repeat that. There are many engineers saying it. I totally disagree. I think that we can rethink them. In this instance, in London, the idea of doing a rotunda that every city has, but doing it in a very simple and more effective way, and coming up with House of Demiron to a market response. So we do a tall tower when the market needs it, and doing it efficiently and elegantly was not an option. It was an opportunity as far as we were concerned. And what you see is, again, some of the tools that we use start to allow us to do complexity. Here, the columns walk inside the building to allow every room to be different. I repeat that. The columns walk inside. At another extreme for a tall building, the Central Bank of Iraq, which is a completely different pendulum of why a tall building should be done. You can see in the context, when Zaha Hadid was invited, we had a long conversation about whether or not to do a tall building. Very simple answer, yes, of course. This country needs repair, it needs pride, it needs a societal change. Why wouldn't we put a tall building up there? But what kind of tall building should it be? So we invented one which is very solid at the base, because it needs protecting. But we made it such that through those tools, it has many faces. So it deals environmentally with something that rotates and comes out of the ground and opens up as you go up the building. It's taken a few years, but inshallah, it'll open next year. The second part, then, is the quasi-discipline. So those are kind of the headlines. What do I mean by advanced reverse design? Well, in some ways, the simplistic thing about it is it's some way of walking back through the work of others and moving forward at great speed so that we can actually create new ways of thinking. So not ignoring the past, nor relying on it. What are the new tools? How have the codes changed? What has happened to material? And when you do that, it's amazing. And this wasn't out of the thin air. In 2019, the report on net zero embodied carbon became the big discussion. Having tackled energy, renewable sources, and so on, the big question now for the climate crisis is, let's try and deal with the embodied carbon of materials and the buildings themselves. So born out of that emerging concept, we have actually taken the whole idea in a different direction. So instead of allowing this kind of fragmentation, yet again, I see it in schools, I see it in practices. Today we have experts in architecture who, instead of doing hospitals, only do adaptive reuse or refit or reuse, all those things. We've collapsed that into something very different. In our version of that, we're putting it all into one bucket. And that bucket really deals with advanced interdisciplinary responses. It takes the approach that combines all of this knowledge and tries to respond at speed at whatever the question might be. It's not only for all buildings, and we've thought about it because of the tools and the way we work. So for the Serpentine Pavilion, we were thinking, designing, and making all on the same day. It was that pace. And we learned through that process that you can actually apply advanced reverse design through new materials. And projects like the Birmingham New Street Station, which was for Foreign Office Architects, which to this day I think not many people realize how important and interesting this was as a reverse engineered design building. It was completely built in the 60s, dead, completely dead. And we returned it, and it's now one of the prides of the cities. Other buildings that replicate this, the Angel Building with AHMM was one of the first in London where we managed to do something similar. Very recently, Liverpool Street. Both of these I brought in because they were both shortlisted for Stirling Prize, so I'm getting somewhere with it. In this particular building, we've done the numbers, even calculating the amount of energy we saved through retaining a 1980s building. What have we actually achieved? And we're able to predict how many lives we think we've saved, never mind all the other data we can prove. So the height of that is more recent with Field and Clegg Bradley at the Shrewsbury flax mills. And I thought that would be very important to bring to today's conversation, because it was one of the world's first, it was the first iron-framed building, circa 1787. So John Soane was in his 40s, so Simon is wrong. Calculations were happening, he just wasn't looking at the right place. So there were calculations, there were discussions. It was just that it wasn't quantity surveyors and engineers. It was clients, and they wanted to understand, and they were corresponding in how to bring iron to the material, to the built world, and they managed to build something. It's taken us much, much work and many, many years and lots of historical information of the letters they were writing to each other to invent that particular building. So we can go all the way back to 1787 and re-put this back on the market. Shrewsbury's happy, less crime, social impact, all of those are the targets that we need to collapse. And it's not just about environment. There's more to it. And in a way, that kind of continuity helps, because today we're working with, if the levelling up budget allows it, we are working with Field and Clegg in Liverpool. Following the success of the first project, we won successfully the Grade 1 listed building in Liverpool, which will be the first international slavery museum. At Regent's Crescent, where everybody knows this is a postcard building, and as John Nash, we discovered it actually wasn't a John Nash. It had been destroyed, broken up. So we were able to persuade our government that Grade 1 listed and those in charge, Grade 1 listed buildings, when they're not authentic, should be reframed. And we managed to add a floor in return for that. And more recently, on site now, the American Embassy, where we also, it was Grade 2 listed, discovered that actually most of the building was about to fall apart because it was built on American land, in a sense that, we didn't have any control in terms of codes when it was first built. And we managed to, with David Chipperfield, extend the floor and learn that all we could really save was the front facade of the building. We couldn't save anything else, and we retained that. And the last one of these is about a subject that most people are not aware of. Only engineers like me, who dream about piles and foundations, are aware of. So when we look at something as beautiful as the the more recent Olympics stadium, the cycling stadium, the Velodrome, when, to give you some idea, compare it to a 1983 Calgary stadium, exactly the same dimensions, same shape, both doing the same purpose. To time it, we were using those kind of typewriters at the time, and we're at iPad level here. When you look at the difference between the two, what you see is that one which is perceived to be wrong and that one which is perceived to be beautiful has another problem. Under there, the number of piles we put in that building are like that. We have destroyed that land for us ever being to develop it. This is a fact. It's an absolute fact, and I'm going to prove it to you now, because from these four, which I could talk about in terms of the Stirling Prize, I thought I would just bring one to the table because it's a favorite of mine and many others. When it won the Stirling Prize, a lot of architects were anti this building. There still are people who say it's not great, but I think it is a marker for London in terms of design. But what's interesting about it is what we found underneath. So, as well as the Mithras Temple and Londinium, or the beginning of London underneath our building, which stopped us for 2 years, what we discovered is this is what we'd done to the ground in the previous 100 years. So all the grey piles are 4 or 5 generations of engineers just piling. The site was dead when we actually undid it. So a lot of technology was put through there, and that kind of work really reminds me that what's below the ground is much worse than what we're seeing, and we need to rethink it. And we've been very fortunate to do that kind of project, and more recently, a film clip of Norton Folgate, which has taken at least, despite all the objections, it's now turned out to be incredible. I'm not going to name all of the architects, it will take me too long. As a child, my favorite toy was a marble. I used to trade with kids, take their marbles in return for doing their maths homework at the age of 7. This was something that I was fascinated by, because marbles are a whole, and they are beautiful in their parts. They were really beautiful inside, and I always wondered how you make a whole like that. So this takes me back to how I began my talk, that the marbling of technology, practice, teaching, and industry is vital in trying to sort our problems out. And there is a hegemony of technology and science, and if you're not careful, you'll forget that they're not innocent. You'll also forget the binary, and you will also remember, or at least forget, that you have responsibility and accountability, but more than anything else, most of the things they produce, technology produces, has no soul. If you look at materials very quickly, so I'm going to go faster now. When we look, we evangelize about one material, we demonize another, we should never build in steel, let's build everything in straw. All those conversations frustrated me from 2019 onwards, because there was no science behind a lot of this. It was headlines. And I have to say, fortunately for the next generation who kept asking us to do these things, we were able to see the reality of some of this. So yes, it's true that we are building more in concrete than we are in timber, for example. So if you put the footprint of that stadium, the amount of concrete we use is, that tall, 2,500 meters tall in a year. So we do use a lot of concrete. Why don't we clean it up rather than say, let's not build? The global south is not going to stop pouring concrete. So our reaction to that was really, David Watson is somewhere in here, our research group started to look at how we can capture concrete, working with Imperial College and people like Ceratec. And we're finding ways of actually cleaning up both concrete and steel. This, I think, is a much, much better approach. Having created some of these problems, we're probably going to say that technology is what will get us out of here. And this particular project, the Fino Science Center, was at the peak. I call it the Concord moment in construction, because you can see the plan and the section are nothing like any architects will understand what we draw every day. When it was invented with Zahadid's office, it's a single surface project, no grids on it. completely one big mass of concrete. And we managed to build it. Would we ever do that again? No, because it was so complex and so difficult to do, and the tools we invented, the type of concrete we used, today would not work in the crisis that we know of. But should we never have done it is not correct, because it's projects like that and tools like that that also allow us to do buildings like this. So we use the same tools and self-compacting concrete that we learnt about from another project in one of David Chipperfield's projects in the Turner. So we shouldn't really demonize these things. There's a need to balance things. And COP29 last week was held in this building, which was one of the extremes that came out of Zaha's office at that time. You might say, why should we ever have built it? Well, same reason. Baku wanted Sydney Opera House, and why shouldn't they have it? Why should it belong only to Australia? Why can't Eurasia have some kind of pride? So there was a kind of moment when we chose to do this. We were almost stopped by the British government because at the time there was concern over there about human rights issues. But I bring it here because it has a 1,500-seater opera house inside it, which is one of the best in the world. Absolutely brilliant. And when we attended the opening ceremony, Zaha's office were very fortunate in that the King of Morocco was in there and he said, "Can I have one?" And we did that. We did it, and we've just opened it very recently. Completely different context, same purpose, same function, but today it's on their currency. Look at the pride of that country in terms of doing a building which Zaha did in the Maghreb in Africa. So there are always reasons for all of these things, and I'm coming to the close. I had to find a way of connecting back to Soane, and I discovered that on the Triumphal Bridge, he won the gold medal. And I have always thought this was one of the, we all regret things that never got built. For me, this is one of the main things that I think I wish it had been built. We wouldn't have had to do some of the other things that have made headlines in terms of bridges in the world. This was the most incredible piece of work. And I have always thought, when I was asked, what is the connection between you and Soane? Well, my bridge version is this with Bjarke Ingels, which is a twisted bridge that's actually a museum, so it's functioning and it's built. And I believe quite strongly that if Soane was around, we would have built the Triumphal Bridge, because I think I have the confidence to convince people that we can do that. You can see inside, it's really well visited. Like the architecture or not, it is a transdisciplinary question being answered in a slightly different way by an interdisciplinary collaboration. And why would we not allow this kind of thinking to go on? During the pandemic, India was building many airports, and with Grimshaw's and Haptic were somewhere in here. We won the competition to build this particular airport in Noida. We were happy to do it. It was when all the controversy was going on. Should we ever build any more airports? Well, actually, in the conversation, within 4 years, and everything I'm showing you, they've actually built it. So why wouldn't you do this? And why should we not consider the Global South in these conversations? Sometimes you get lucky, and when something is in your mind quite a lot, somehow it appears in your work. And the idea from Japanese and Chinese architecture from the 12th century of reciprocal structures was something we were discussing quite a lot in the office when we were looking for solutions to reduce material. And I was very lucky that a project arrived that is very dear to my heart across the road from the Soane with Grafton. And we had lots of conversation about their connection to Soane. But for us, it was about a vertical reciprocal idea. So the whole building is based on a changing grid of columns, many up at the top, but only 4 or 5 at the bottom, which is not new, but is certainly fast-paced the way it used to be done. And at the time, it was questionable whether people would like it or not. The RIBA jury who went to select or see whether it deserved the Stirling Prize, got it completely wrong. They didn't even shortlisted it, which to me was criminal. But that's architects for you. Ismaili Center in Houston with Farshid Musavi, and the client is also here tonight, was an international competition, much like all the work I've shown you. And there are lots of stories to tell, but I only wanted to talk about one thing, which was the reciprocal idea. Because Farshid had come up with an incredible piece of work, which she will talk about one day. It's not my place to do. But the idea of building in Houston in that climate with a civic building, let's say, led to a solution that demanded, let's go back to the dome structures. So all domes are done as reciprocal systems. And the prayer space in this building is a reciprocal system because it was a flat system, and we'd put an Ivan on top, which is both Arabic and Persian, for a public space that has 3 open sides. So you can see the connection back to Marshall and all the way back to John Soane, because there was a lot of connection in the work they did and how we solved that. And of course, you don't have to give up entirely. The central dome is also a reciprocal system, and it is absolutely gorgeous. What's interesting is that we also hijack some of these projects. So even though we weren't appointed to do certain things, our beta tools on how to measure wind-driven rain analysis or air quality analysis, because we've got a road going next to us, we started to operate on live projects, and this was one of the projects that we've used to try and prove to ourselves that some of these tools work. Of course, we won't publish it. Nobody's paying us for it. So. But you see the complexity of the building. And in that vein, recently, July the 8th, flood, 1 p.m., and it disappears at 9 a.m. The work of Nelson Bird Waltz and the civil engineering work that we were involved in, and Farshid in positioning the building where it is, mitigates the climate problem already. A major hurricane, and within a few hours, our site was clear, and you can see the garden was back to normal. The rest of Houston was not. I want to try and rush through this, but I need to do it very quickly if I can. The modern and old mixture is not something I'm afraid of. We've done quite a lot of it. Al Muaji Fort, where we've gone to mud structures. Today we're working in Al Ula, I won't show the projects, where we're looking at stone and mud. So we are looking at all of these questions that the next generation is asking. And sometimes some of those questions actually allow us to go beyond the remit. So in this particular case, the drones spray mud onto a tent in Milan in order to stiffen it. So we take mud structures and see if we can put them through the type of technologies that we could use. Okay, I thought we were being clever with the mud. I went to Bangladesh and discovered this is how they make their bricks. And very quickly, the client persuaded me not to do it that way. In Venice, very recently, we've done something similar by taking the waste and making bricks out of that. So all of that stuff in mud and straw is going on. I want to bring the silent ecosystem before I finish. I've been very fortunate to be involved with education. Mohsin encouraged me to work at the AA way back when I started the practice. And then I went to KTH for 5 years, and then recently 13 years at Harvard. So that ecosystem has allowed me to question a number of things. One of the first pieces of work was really about the absence of architects in infrastructure buildings. The outcome was that building with Bjarke Ingels, which is a world-class waste station. And house prices have gone up by about 20% around that building, just so you know why we do these things. In that kind of research work, I've also looked very closely at the use of CLT, first housed with Frederick Ludwig here in the UK in CLT, which is then replicated in a way in Atlanta. And we wrote a very beautiful book about the use of this particular material and why it's not that sustainable with Jennifer Bonner. So we continue to do these pieces of work, with, again, teaching with Farshid in France. I looked very carefully at embodied energy of all the biomaterials with my students. And then more recently with Amin, the stone towers that we looked at for the Earl's Court site. So all of those things come back into play. And sometimes I snigger because these cute projects from our world, taking them to continents like Africa and celebrating them is amazing stuff for Instagram and all that publicity. But you have to question it. When Marina brought, thanks to Neil, brought this particular Kundibari project here, the first problem we had is we don't have bamboo the size that they have in Bangladesh. We eventually managed to get it done, despite a lot of obstacles, including insurance, safety, blah, 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 blah. We managed to build it. It was very successful. And you can see, in the meantime, we also experimented with its poison. The poison is the joints. It's made out of steel. So we looked at the way in which we could rethink the joint, and we're still continuing. But what's scary is that for the price of what she pays for one, we paid for 100 by just building one prototype in here. So there is this balance of who is rich doing what and who is poor doing what that I think struck me when we looked at the price of the real one versus what we managed to put together. I'm coming to the end. 2 more slides. A very recent project, my colleague Chris Blust is in here somewhere. We won as a design competition very recently for the Islamic Art Biennale in Jeddah, which was a very tough jury. I think initially 100 entries, typical in terms of calling out. I think 5 or 6 were shortlisted, and we were very fortunate with East Architects and Ryan Thabet, artist, architect, engineer, proposing together, and this is the jury, not us. They selected that team because it was a unified framework of 3 people who believed in what they all did without fighting about it. We proposed the Masalah, and what's really amazing about it is we're using palm frowns to make it. So it's a new type of timber for the region that we are hoping will now go out to the world. It will open on the 25th of January. I saw it 2 weeks ago just to make sure it will stand up, and if it doesn't, do I leave the country? That's the kind of... the office have done an amazing job, the collaborators included, and we are pretty confident that it's going to be a massive hit. Now, I had to add a project this evening because my dearest friend, Francis Kere, at 4 o'clock today, texted me, I'm in London, I've just come in from Berlin. Please, can I come to your lecture? Can you believe that? He's a very good friend. And probably I was surprised by that text, I have to say. We are together very excited about the Las Vegas Museum, where much of this is going to come together without Francis having to change what Francis is and what Francis does. I'm finished, and what shall I leave you with? What might the future be? Well, I think that there is no doubt we're in a perilous time on planet Earth. Even in the recent research, we see 3 of the hottest days were in 2024. We witnessed record-breaking temperatures recently in 2024. I still think that we have to look closer at how to become more sustainable rather than the doom that goes with that. And optimism isn't enough anymore. It is an urgent crisis, so we're not going to berate that. But the heaviness of the well-meaning martyrdom of climate and the heaviness of the problem of climate is holding back opportunities, and we need to find ways of doing better with that. And I don't necessarily mean my generation, I mean the next generation is going to get out of this in some way or the other. The areas of synthesizing, creating, and disciplinary aspects of what we do are pretty well explained. The 2 missing aspects, to me at least, are the deep ethics and morals that go behind this. And that's what I wanted to talk about. And respect for each other and everyone else. So I conclude with a quote from another historian this time, which was Arnold Toynbee. For those who don't know, he coined the word Industrial Revolution. And he wrote that the 20th century will be remembered chiefly not as an age of political conflicts and technical inventions, but as an age in which human society dared to think of the health of the whole of human race as a practical objective. Thank you.